You want to give me a present? Get out of my life. You're the worst mother anyone could ever have." The words hung in the air of the elegant country club dining room, sharp as glass shards and just as cutting. For a moment, everything around me seemed to freeze. The waitstaff pouring champagne, the wedding planner reviewing tomorrow's timeline, the curious glances from Blake's parents. I, Sophia Carter, 58 years old, stood perfectly still, my hand still outstretched toward the seating chart I'd been trying to discuss with my daughter. "Amber," I said quietly, "let's step outside and talk about this calmly." "There's nothing to talk about," Amber hissed, her perfectly made-up face contorted with a rage that seemed disproportionate to my simple suggestion about moving her fragile grandmother to a table farther from the band. "You always do this. Try to control everything, embarrass me in front of everyone." "I was just thinking of Grandma Helen's hearing aids," I began. "Stop! Just stop!" Amber's voice rose, drawing more attention from the wedding party gathered for the rehearsal dinner. "This is my wedding, mine, not yours, not Grandma's. I've worked too hard to have everything perfect." Blake, my soon-to-be son-in-law, shifted uncomfortably beside her, but remained silent. His parents exchanged glances that managed to convey both embarrassment and a certain smug validation, as if Amber's outburst confirmed everything they'd suspected about her upbringing. "Amber, sweetheart," I tried again, aware of the growing audience, "I only want what's best for everyone tomorrow." "What's best?" She laughed, a brittle sound devoid of humor. "What's best would be if you disappeared." "Seriously, Mom, if you really want to give me a wedding present, just disappear from my life. I'm sick of apologizing for you to Blake's family." The room went silent. Even the waitstaff froze in place. Blake's mother, Victoria, pressed her expensive linen napkin to her lips, her eyes gleaming with something that might have been pity, but looked more like satisfaction. "Amber," Blake finally murmured, touching her arm gently. "Maybe we should—" "No, Blake, I'm done pretending." Amber shook off his hand, her diamond engagement ring catching the light. "Do you know what Victoria asked me yesterday? She asked if my mother would be comfortable at the country club, or if she'd feel out of place, as if you're some kind of charity case we're including out of obligation." I absorbed this information with a strange detachment. After 3 decades of single motherhood, of double shifts and deferred dreams, of scrimping and saving to provide dance lessons and SAT tutors and law school tuition, I was being discussed as if I were an embarrassing relative to be tolerated. "I see," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And what did you tell Victoria?" Amber's silence answered more eloquently than words could have. "Amber has been very gracious about including everyone," Victoria interjected smoothly, her country club poise unshakable. "We simply want tomorrow to go perfectly for both families." Both families. As if my family, just me, really, and elderly Grandma Helen, were somehow comparable to the Prescotts with their old money and legacy admissions to Ivy League schools. "It will be perfect," I assured her, with a smile that cost me everything to produce. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I need some air." I walked out of the dining room with my back straight and my head high, feeling the weight of their stares. Only once I reached the empty ladies' lounge did I allow myself to sink onto a velvet chair, my hands shaking as the full impact of my daughter's words hit me. "You're the worst mother anyone could have." Was I? I stared at my reflection in the ornate mirror, a woman with silver-streaked dark hair cut in a practical bob, wearing a department store dress I'd spent hours selecting. Not glamorous like Victoria Prescott with her salon-maintained blonde perfection, but not the embarrassment Amber had portrayed either. I thought back over the years, the Halloween costumes sewn late into the night, the school lunches packed with handwritten notes, the college care packages, the quiet support through Amber's first heartbreak. I'd made mistakes, certainly. All parents do. But the worst mother anyone could have? My phone buzzed with a text from Amber. "Where did you go? The planner needs to go over your entrance timing again." No apology. No acknowledgement of the cruel words still reverberating in my head. Just impatience that I wasn't fulfilling my assigned role in her perfect production. I texted back, "Not feeling well. Going home to rest before tomorrow. Everything will be fine." As I drove home to the modest 3-bedroom house where I'd raised Amber alone, after her father decided fatherhood was too constraining for his lifestyle, I found myself thinking about the property across town where Amber and Blake now lived. The beautiful colonial that had belonged to my father passed to me upon his death 3 years ago, with specific instructions that I could transfer it to Amber when the time was right. I'd allowed them to move in immediately, planning to sign over the deed as a wedding gift, a fresh start without the burden of a mortgage. Amber had never questioned this arrangement, had never asked about the property's ownership. She'd simply accepted, as she'd always accepted my sacrifices, with an entitlement that I'd mistaken for confidence. At home, I kicked off my sensible heels and sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by wedding preparations. My mother-of-the-bride dress hanging on the laundry room door, the handcrafted guest book I'd spent weeks creating, the emergency kit of fashion tape and aspirin and Band-Aids I'd assembled for tomorrow. Summa de minha vida, I whispered to the empty room, testing how the words felt in my mouth. Disappear from my life. Perhaps, after all these years, it was time to give my daughter exactly what she'd asked for. I reached for my laptop, opened it, and began to type. The morning light filtering through my bedroom curtains found me already awake, my eyes gritty from a night spent alternating between tears and methodical planning. My phone displayed 17 missed calls and 23 text messages, most from Amber, growing increasingly frantic as the night progressed. Mom, the planner needs to confirm your hair appointment time. Mom, are you seriously not answering? The rehearsal isn't even over. Mother, this is ridiculous. Call me now. And finally, sent at 2:17 a.m. Fine, be that way. But you better be at the venue by 10 a.m. tomorrow, or I swear to God, I will never forgive you. I set the phone aside and walked to my closet, pushing past the garment bag containing my mother-of-the-bride dress, a soft blue silk I'd saved for months to afford. Instead, I pulled out practical clothes, jeans, a comfortable sweater, slip-on shoes. Today would require mobility, not ceremony. At my small kitchen table, I reviewed the documents I'd spent the night gathering: property deeds, bank statements, contracts with wedding vendors, and years of financial records meticulously organized in my old-fashioned filing cabinet. The paper trail of maternal sacrifice laid bare in black and white. My father had been an accountant, and he'd taught me the importance of documentation. People can argue with your words, he'd say, but they can't argue with numbers. How right he had been. I made my first call at precisely 7 a.m. to Jonathan Mills, my father's attorney and the executor of his will. Sophia, everything all right? Isn't today the big wedding? His familiar voice carried concern. There's been a change of plans, Jonathan. I need to discuss the property on Maple Avenue, the one currently occupied by my daughter and her fiancé. Your father's house? I thought you were planning to transfer ownership to Amber as a wedding gift. Plans change, I replied, my voice calmer than I felt. I'd like to explore my options for selling the property. Immediately. A pause. Sophia, is everything okay? This seems sudden. I've had a revelation, Jonathan, about respect, boundaries, and the true nature of gift-giving. I glanced at the property deed before me. The house is still legally in my name, correct? Yes, absolutely. Your father left it to you without conditions. His suggestion about transferring it to Amber was just that. A suggestion. Legally, you're free to sell it if you wish. And what would be the fastest possible timeline for such a sale? Jonathan coughed slightly. Well, in today's market, with a desirable property like that, if you're willing to accept a slightly below-market offer, I know several investors who purchase with cash and minimal contingencies. We could potentially close in as little as 48 hours. Perfect. Please make the calls. I'll come to your office at noon to sign whatever's necessary. My next call was to Margaret Willis, the wedding planner Amber had selected for her dream wedding. A woman whose services I was paying for despite Amber allowing Blake's family to believe they were contributing significantly. Mrs. Carter, I was just about to call you. We missed you at the end of the rehearsal last night, and there are a few details. Margaret, I interrupted gently. I'm afraid there's been a significant change. I need you to contact all vendors and cancel today's event. Silence, then a sputtering response. Cancel? Mrs. Carter, the wedding is in 6 hours. We can't possibly. Check your contract, Margaret. Section 7, paragraph 3 specifies that as the financially responsible party, I retain the right to cancel with compensation for the vendor's time and materials. I understand there will be substantial cancellation fees. I'm prepared to pay them all. But the bride, Ms. Carter, will be devastated. I'm sure she will. I agreed, remembering the venom in Amber's voice. You're the worst mother anyone could have. Nevertheless, please proceed with the cancellations. All of them. Venue, catering, flowers, music, photography, everything. After ending the call with the thoroughly flustered wedding planner, I moved systematically through my list: the caterer, the florist, the string quartet, the photographer. With each call, I calmly identified myself as the contracting party, referenced the relevant cancellation clause, and authorized whatever payments were necessary to compensate for the last-minute change. By 9:30 a.m., I had dismantled every aspect of the $75,000 wedding I'd spent 2 years saving for. My retirement account was significantly lighter, but a strange sense of peace had settled over me. My phone continued to buzz with incoming calls. Amber, the wedding planner, even Blake once. But I let them all go to voicemail as I packed an overnight bag and gathered the documents I'd organized overnight. The final item on my morning's agenda was perhaps the most difficult. I called my elderly mother, who had been so looking forward to seeing her only granddaughter walk down the aisle. "Mom," I said when she answered, "there's been a change of plans with the wedding." "What's happened, Sophia? Is Amber all right?" "Amber is physically fine," I assured her, "but the wedding won't be happening today. I'll explain everything later, but for now, I need you to trust me." A pause, then my mother's voice, softer but certain. "I've always trusted you, Sophia. You're the most reliable person I know." Her simple faith nearly broke my composure. "Thank you, Mom. That means more than you know right now." As I ended the call, my doorbell rang with an insistence that could only belong to one person. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and opened the door to face my daughter. Amber stood on my porch in designer yoga pants and an expensive sweatshirt, her face flushed with anger and her eyes wild with panic. "Mom? What the hell? I've been calling you all night. The hair and makeup people are already at the venue, and Margaret says she can't reach you and—" She stopped abruptly, taking in my casual clothes and the packed bag visible in the hallway behind me. "Why aren't you dressed? We need to leave for the venue in like an hour." I studied my daughter's face, the face I'd memorized as a newborn, kissed better after countless childhood injuries, watched mature into beautiful adulthood. The face that had contorted with contempt just hours ago as she publicly rejected 28 years of maternal devotion. "There's been a change of plans, Amber," I said quietly. "The wedding has been canceled." Her expression froze, then transformed into something between horror and rage. "What are you talking about? Canceled? That's not— You can't—" She pushed past me into the house, already pulling out her phone. "I need to call Margaret right now and fix whatever miscommunication—" "It's not a miscommunication," I interrupted, closing the door behind her. "I called every vendor this morning and canceled their services. The venue, the catering, the flowers, all of it." Amber turned to me slowly, her face draining of color. "You— What? You can't do that. It's my wedding." "Actually, I can." And I did. Every contract was in my name, with my signature, paid for with my money. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice suddenly small. "Why would you do this to me?" I met her gaze steadily. "Last night, you made a request. You asked me to give you a gift, to disappear from your life. You called me the worst mother anyone could have." The words still stung, but my voice remained even. "I've decided to honor your request. This is the first step." Amber's phone began to ring. Blake's ringtone. She answered it with trembling hands. "Blake, something's wrong. My mother says she canceled the wedding. I don't understand what's happening." I could hear his voice, tinny through the speaker, equally confused and increasingly alarmed. I gestured for Amber to follow me into the kitchen, where I'd laid out the documentation of my overnight work. "I need to go," Amber told Blake abruptly. "Come to my mom's house, now." She ended the call and stared at the papers spread across my kitchen table. "What is all this?" "This," I said, picking up the first folder, "is the truth about your perfect life." "What are you talking about?" "What truth?" Amber's voice wavered between anger and fear as she stared at the array of documents spread across my kitchen table. "Please, sit down," I said, gesturing to a chair. For once, Amber complied without argument. Perhaps too stunned by the cancellation bombshell to resist, I selected the first folder, labeled Wedding, and opened it. "This contains every contract, deposit slip, and payment confirmation for the wedding that won't be happening today. Total expenditure, $78,452.36, all paid from my accounts." Amber's eyes widened. But Blake's parents contributed nothing, I finished for her, despite what you led them to believe. A flush crept up her neck. I never said they were paying. They just assumed, and it was easier to let them think that I couldn't afford to give my daughter a proper wedding, I supplied. That you were graciously including your embarrassing mother, despite the financial burden it placed on you and Blake's family? The direct hit landed. Amber's flush deepened. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that, Amber. I pulled out a specific document, an email from Victoria Prescott to the country club's event coordinator that Amber had accidentally forwarded to me months ago. Your future mother-in-law specifically mentioned how kind Blake was to subsidize such an extravagant affair when the bride's family clearly couldn't manage it. Amber's eyes skittered away from mine. Victoria is just, she says things sometimes. It doesn't mean anything, and you never corrected her. It wasn't a question. You allowed Blake's family to believe I was some struggling, unsophisticated burden you were tolerating out of obligation. Mom, you're overreacting. The wedding is in a few hours. We can talk about this later. There is no wedding, Amber. Not today. I closed the wedding folder and opened the next one, labeled Education. What is all this? Amber demanded, her voice rising. Some kind of weird scrapbook of financial martyrdom? Documentation, I corrected calmly. Something your grandfather taught me the value of long ago. I removed a stack of tuition receipts, loan documents, and bank transfers. Your education. Private elementary school when the public school in our district was underperforming, $124,000. SAT tutoring and college application coaching, $8,700. Undergraduate degree at Northeastern, $183,000. Law school at Boston University, $213,550. I placed another document on top, a loan satisfaction letter. The student loans you think Blake's father secretly paid off as a graduation gift? That was me, liquidating the investment account I'd maintained since before you were born. Amber stared at the papers, her expression shifting from defiance to confusion. But Mr. Prescott said, he told Blake. He lied, apparently. Or perhaps Blake lied to you. Either way, I'm the one who ensured you graduated debt-free, not the Prescotts. I tapped the loan satisfaction letter. The important thing isn't who paid, Amber. It's that you never once questioned it. You simply accepted that someone had magically solved your financial problem without ever considering it might have been your embarrassing mother. The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent. Blake, undoubtedly. Don't answer it yet, I said, opening the third and most significant folder. There's one more thing we need to discuss before Blake joins us. What now? Amber asked, her voice smaller than before. More evidence of what a terrible daughter I am? No, I replied, sliding the property deed across the table. Evidence of what you're about to lose. Amber glanced at the document, her brow furrowing. The house deed? Why are you showing me this? Look at the owner's name, Amber. She scanned the document, then looked up, genuine confusion in her eyes. I don't understand. Why is your name on our house deed? Because it's not your house. It never was. I kept my voice gentle, despite the gravity of what I was revealing. The house on Maple Avenue belonged to your grandfather. When he died 3 years ago, he left it to me. The doorbell rang again, followed by knocking. Amber barely seemed to notice, her attention fixed on the deed in her trembling hands. But we've been living there since before we got engaged. You said it was my inheritance. I said it was part of your grandfather's legacy that would eventually come to you, I corrected. I allowed you and Blake to move in, thinking I would transfer ownership to you as a wedding gift. I never charged you rent, never asked for contributions toward the property taxes or insurance I've been paying. So the house is yours? Amber's voice had taken on a strange, hollow quality. Yes, and as of this morning, it's being sold. I placed the preliminary sale agreement beside the deed. The closing will happen Monday morning. Amber's face drained of all color. You're selling our house? You can't do that. All our things, our lives, we just finished renovating the kitchen. With my money, I reminded her. The $45,000 loan from your grandfather's estate that you never questioned, that came directly from my retirement savings. The knocking at the front door grew more insistent. I stood and walked toward it, pausing to look back at my daughter, still frozen in shock at my kitchen table, surrounded by the paper trail of maternal sacrifices she'd taken for granted. You should prepare Blake for what he's about to learn, I advised. It might be easier coming from you. I opened the door to find Blake on my porch, his handsome face creased with confusion and alarm. Behind him, his parents were just emerging from their luxury SUV, Victoria's expression a mixture of concern and poorly concealed curiosity. "Sophia," Blake began, his voice pitched low as if sharing sensitive information. "There seems to be some confusion about the wedding. The venue called my mother saying everything had been canceled, but that can't be right. Amber's not answering her phone and—" "Blake," I interrupted gently. "Amber is inside. There's no confusion. The wedding has indeed been canceled, and there are some other matters you all need to be aware of." I stepped back, gesturing for him to enter. "Please come in. You too, Richard, Victoria. This concerns all of you." Blake hesitated, clearly sensing something significant was unfolding, but then moved past me into the house. His parents followed more cautiously, Victoria's critical gaze sweeping over my modest home as if cataloging its deficiencies. "Amber," Blake called, his voice tense with worry. "In the kitchen," I directed, following behind the Prescott family as they moved through my living room with its simple furnishings and family photographs. When we entered the kitchen, Amber was still sitting where I'd left her, but now tears streamed down her face as she clutched the property deed in trembling hands. "Amber, sweetheart, what's wrong?" Blake rushed to her side, kneeling beside her chair. "What's happening?" Amber looked up at him, then at his parents hovering uncertainly in the doorway, then finally at me. In that moment, her eyes held something I hadn't seen in years. Recognition, not of me as her embarrassing mother or convenient banker, but recognition of what she had done, what she had said, and what was now unfolding as a result. "Mom is selling our house," she whispered to Blake. "It was never ours at all." Blake's confusion deepened. "What are you talking about? Of course it's ours. We've been living there for 2 years. "Actually," I interjected, "that's the first matter we need to clarify." As the Prescotts gathered around my kitchen table, I began the systematic dismantling of the carefully constructed narrative that had allowed Amber to position herself as Blake's equal in wealth and status, a narrative built entirely on my silent sacrifices and her deliberate omissions. The house was just the beginning. "Mrs. Carter," Richard Prescott began, his authoritative baritone carrying the confidence of a man accustomed to controlling any room he entered. "While I understand there may be some family dispute happening here, surely canceling the entire wedding is an overreaction. There are 200 guests, many who have traveled—" "Dad, wait," Blake interrupted, his attention fixed on the property deed Amber still clutched. "What's this about our house?" Victoria moved closer, peering over her son's shoulder at the document. Her perfectly maintained features shifted from confusion to something harder as comprehension dawned. "The house is in Sophia's name? But you told us it was your inheritance, Amber." All eyes turned to my daughter, who seemed to shrink in her chair. "I never exactly said that," she mumbled. "I just didn't correct certain assumptions." "Assumptions you deliberately encouraged," I added quietly. "Just as you encouraged the assumption that you and Blake were financing the wedding." Victoria's head snapped up. "What does that mean? Blake told us you insisted on paying for everything as per tradition." "I did pay for everything," I confirmed. "Every deposit, every vendor, every detail of the now canceled event. $78,452.36 to be precise." Richard Prescott's jaw tightened. "That's impossible. The venue alone is $22,000 for the day, plus $7,500 for the premium catering package and $4,200 for the open bar," I finished for him, sliding the contract across the table. "All paid from my accounts." Blake turned to Amber, bewilderment evident in his expression. "But you said your mom could only contribute a token amount, and that my parents were handling the major expenses while we covered the rest." "Another creative interpretation of reality," I noted, my tone measured despite the anger simmering beneath. "The reality is that I've liquidated investments, taken a loan against my 401k, and depleted most of my savings to give Amber the wedding she demanded." Victoria's face had transformed from skeptical to thunderous. "So all those meetings where you graciously thanked us for our generosity were based on a fiction," I confirmed. "One that Amber maintained, allowing you to believe I was financially and socially inadequate." "Mom, stop," Amber pleaded, tears streaming now. "You're making it sound so calculated." "Wasn't it?" I asked simply. "Last night, you told me to disappear from your life. You called me the worst mother anyone could have, all because I suggested moving your grandmother to a table where she might actually hear the wedding she helped finance. Blake stood abruptly, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of distress. I don't understand. Why would you lie about this, Amber? About your mom paying for everything, about the house. I didn't lie, Amber insisted. I just didn't explain everything. Your parents are so judgmental about money, about status. They were already looking down on Mom for being a single mother, for her job, for everything. If they knew the truth, that your mother is significantly more financially responsible and generous than you portrayed her, Richard Prescott interjected, his tone shifting from authoritative to coldly analytical. That she owns the house you've been presenting as yours? That she financed the education you claim to have scholarships for? I glanced at Richard, surprised by this accurate assessment. Perhaps Blake's father was more perceptive than his country club exterior suggested. The scholarships were real, Amber protested weakly. They just didn't cover everything. They covered approximately 12% of your total educational expenses, I corrected, tapping the education folder. I covered the rest. Blake paced the small kitchen, visibly processing these revelations. So the house renovations we've been doing were financed by a $45,000 loan from me that Amber has never mentioned repaying, I confirmed. The loan that funded the kitchen you designed specifically to impress your mother, Victoria. Victoria flushed slightly at this direct reference. I never asked for— No, you didn't, I agreed. But you did comment during your first visit that the original kitchen was charmingly retro, by which you meant outdated. Within a week, Amber was begging me for money to remodel it. I turned to my daughter, whose tears had given way to a sort of numb shock. Amber, for years I've watched you contort yourself to meet the Prescott's expectations, changing how you dress, how you speak, even rewriting your personal history to seem more aligned with their social circle. I said nothing, believing it was a phase you'd outgrow. But last night made it clear that you've gone beyond adaptation to outright rejection of who you are and where you come from. That's not fair, Amber whispered. No, it's not, I agreed. None of this is fair. It's not fair that I worked 2 jobs to raise you alone after your father decided fatherhood was too restrictive. It's not fair that I've depleted my retirement to fund your ambitions. And it's certainly not fair that after all that, you're ashamed of me. Blake had stopped pacing, his expression hardening as he looked at Amber with new eyes. You told me your mother refused to contribute to our down payment when we were looking at houses in Beacon Hill. That's why we settled for living in your grandfather's old house. Another creative interpretation, I confirmed. The truth is, Amber never asked me about a down payment because she knew I'd already stretched myself thin paying off her law school loans. The loans you believe your father paid, Blake. Richard Prescott cleared his throat, looking distinctly uncomfortable. I never said I paid off any loans. I merely congratulated Amber on becoming debt-free and allowed your son to believe you were responsible, I noted. An interesting parallel to Amber's own selective truths. The kitchen fell silent as the full implications settled over everyone. Victoria Prescott, despite her obvious distaste for the situation, seemed almost impressed by the methodical way I was dismantling Amber's carefully constructed facade. So, what happens now? Blake finally asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. The wedding is cancelled, the house is being sold. Are you pressing charges for fraud or something? No, I said, softening slightly at the genuine distress in his face. There's no fraud here, Blake. Just a daughter who was ashamed of her mother, and a mother who finally realized no amount of sacrifice would ever be enough. But the house, Amber began, will be sold on Monday to a cash buyer, I finished for her. You and Blake have until 5 p.m. tomorrow to remove your personal belongings. Anything left behind will be donated. You can't do this, Amber cried, finally finding her voice again. Where are we supposed to go? All our friends think we're getting married today. We can't just— You'll figure it out, I interrupted, echoing the dismissive phrase she'd used countless times when I'd expressed concerns about wedding costs. Perhaps the Prescotts will offer you a place to stay while you regroup. Victoria and Richard exchanged glances that suggested this was not a foregone conclusion. The family dynamics were clearly shifting in real time as Blake reevaluated not just his relationship with Amber, but his understanding of his own parents' role in perpetuating certain fictions. I still don't understand, Blake said, turning to me with genuine confusion. Why now? Why not confront Amber about all this before today? I considered his question carefully, aware that my answer would shape how all of them, including Amber, understood my actions. Because until last night, I believed the sacrifices were worth it, I replied honestly. I told myself that motherhood is about putting your child's needs first, that Amber's happiness was what mattered most. But when she looked me in the eye and told me to disappear from her life, when she called me the worst mother anyone could have, something broke. Not just my heart, but the delusion that my sacrifice was making her a better person. It wasn't. It was enabling her to become someone who could treat others, treat me, as disposable. Amber flinched as if I'd slapped her. I'm not doing this to punish you, Amber. I continued more gently. I'm doing this because you asked for a gift, for me to disappear from your life. I'm giving you exactly what you requested. The house sale simply ensures I can start my new life somewhere else, as you demanded. Where will you go? Richard asked unexpectedly. I met his gaze, seeing a flicker of something like respect in his eyes. I've always wanted to live near the ocean. Tomorrow I'm driving to the Carolina coast to look at small beachfront properties. Half the proceeds from the house will fund my new start. The other half has already been donated to a foundation supporting single mothers pursuing higher education. Victoria made a small sound, something between a gasp and reluctant admiration. You've certainly been thorough in your response to Amber's behavior. Efficiency is necessary when you've spent decades doing the work of two parents, I replied simply. Now, I believe we've covered the essential information. You all have significant matters to address, notifying guests, finding new housing, re-evaluating certain relationships. I need to finish packing. I stood, signaling that the conversation was over. The Prescotts rose somewhat uncertainly, but Amber remained seated, staring at the documents that chronicled her lifetime of received sacrifices. Mom, she whispered, you can't just leave. Actually, I can, I corrected gently. You specifically asked me to, in front of witnesses, less than 24 hours ago. I didn't mean it like that. I was stressed about the wedding, about everything being perfect. And now you're stressed about having no wedding and no house, I observed. Actions have consequences, Amber. It's time you experienced some of yours. As I escorted the shell-shocked group toward my front door, I felt a strange lightness beginning to replace the heavy resignation that had burdened me for years. For the first time in Amber's life, I had prioritized my own well-being over her demands, and somehow, the world hadn't ended. It had merely shifted into something more honest, more balanced, and I was finally ready to embrace it. The hours following the Prescotts' departure unfolded in a surreal haze. I methodically continued my packing, sorting through decades of accumulated possessions with a detachment that surprised me. Family photo albums, carefully preserved artwork from Amber's childhood, holiday decorations lovingly collected over years of creating traditions for just the two of us. All of it required decisions. What to keep, what to donate, what to store. My phone buzzed incessantly with messages and calls, from confused wedding guests who'd arrived at an empty venue, from my sister in Phoenix demanding explanations, from Amber cycling between tearful pleas and angry accusations. I silenced it all, focusing instead on the practical tasks at hand. By late afternoon, a strange calm had settled over me. I sat on my back porch with a cup of tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors I hadn't properly appreciated in years. Tomorrow, I would begin driving toward a new life. Tonight, I would allow myself this moment of reflection. The sound of tires on my driveway broke the silence. I didn't need to look to know who it was. The hesitant knock that followed confirmed it. "It's open," I called, remaining seated as my elderly mother made her way through the house to join me on the porch. Helen Carter moved slowly these days, her once straight posture now curved with age, but her eyes remained sharp as ever. At 83, she had survived the Great Depression, buried 2 husbands, and raised 3 children, one of whom, my brother Robert, she had also buried after a car accident in his 20s. If anyone understood life's unpredictable cruelties and unexpected blessings, it was my mother. "Well," she said without preamble, lowering herself into the chair beside me, "Alice Thompson called me, said the country club was all decorated with no bride or groom in sight. Want to tell me what's happening?" I smiled faintly. The small-town grapevine remained efficient as ever. "I canceled the wedding," I confirmed, "and sold the house Amber and Blake have been living in. and I'm leaving tomorrow for the Carolina coast. My mother absorbed this information with remarkable equanimity, nodding slightly. Thought it might be something like that. Amber finally pushed too far, didn't she? The simple acknowledgement that my mother had recognized the pattern of behavior I'd been tolerating for years brought unexpected tears to my eyes. She told me to disappear from her life, I said quietly. Called me the worst mother anyone could have. Helen snorted. Ridiculous. I've seen bad mothers, Sophia. Women who abandoned their children, who chose men or drugs over their babies, who inflicted physical and emotional damage without remorse. You're not even in the same universe as those women. I know that, I acknowledged. Intellectually, at least. But hearing those words from my own daughter, after everything, broke something fundamental, my mother finished for me. A bond you thought was unbreakable. Yes. The simple word carried the weight of my shattered illusions about unconditional maternal love. The myth that a mother's sacrifice would always be rewarded with a child's appreciation. Helen reached over with her gnarled hand, patting mine gently. Tell me about the Carolina coast. The abrupt change of subject was so typical of my practical mother that I couldn't help smiling. I've been researching small communities near Wilmington, quiet places with beach access and reasonable property values. I can afford something modest with the house proceeds. Good fishing in that area, Helen noted. Your father and I spent a week there once before you were born. Peaceful, different rhythm from here. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the light fade from the sky. Finally, Helen asked the question I'd been dreading. What happens with Amber now? I sighed, the weight of maternal concern not entirely dispelled despite yesterday's cruel words. I don't know. The practical matters are clear. She and Blake need to find new housing, deal with the wedding cancellation, address the lies she's told. But the personal relationship, I trailed off, uncertain. Needs time, my mother supplied. Distance can bring clarity for both of you. Are you angry with me? I asked suddenly. For canceling the wedding, for selling the house, for leaving? Helen considered this with the thoughtfulness that had always characterized her. Disappointed, perhaps, not in your actions, but in the situation that made them necessary. No grandmother wants to see her family fractured. But angry? No. You've carried Amber single-handedly since she was 5 years old. Even birds push their young from the nest eventually. This feels less like pushing from the nest and more like severing a limb, I admitted. Painful either way, Helen acknowledged, but sometimes necessary for growth, hers and yours. Before I could respond, headlights swept across the yard as another vehicle pulled into my driveway. This time, I recognized Blake's sensible sedan. Reinforcements have arrived, I see, my mother observed dryly. Want me to send him away? I smiled at the protective instinct. No, I'll talk to him. Would you mind making some fresh tea? Helen nodded, leveraging herself up with practiced determination. Don't let him change your mind, Sophia. You've made the right decision. I watched her make her way inside, before turning my attention to Blake, who approached the porch with visible hesitation. In the fading light, he looked younger than his 30 years, more like the earnest law student Amber had first brought home than the polished attorney he'd become under the Prescott's grooming. Mrs. Carter, he greeted me cautiously, I hope I'm not intruding. That depends on why you're here, Blake, I replied, gesturing to the chair my mother had vacated. He sat, running his hands through his hair in that familiar gesture of distress. I don't even know where to begin. Today has been surreal. I imagine it has, I acknowledged. Finding out your wedding is canceled, your home is being sold, and your fiancé has misrepresented fundamental aspects of your life together, all before noon on what was supposed to be your wedding day. Blake winced. When you put it that way, he exhaled heavily. I'm not here to ask you to change your mind about the house or the wedding. I understand why you've made these decisions. This surprised me. Do you? I think so, he said slowly. After you laid everything out this morning, I had a long conversation with my parents, then with Amber. Things became clearer. In what way? Blake stared at his hands for a moment. My entire relationship with Amber has been built on certain assumptions about her background, her resources, her values, finding out that she deliberately fostered misconceptions, that she was ashamed of you to the point of constructing elaborate fictions. He shook his head. It makes me question everything, including whether you want to marry her, I suggested gently. He looked up, his expression troubled. Is it wrong that I'm asking myself that question? After 4 years together, On what was supposed to be our wedding day? Better today than tomorrow, I offered. Or next year, when children might be involved. Blake nodded slowly. My parents have taken a suite at the Grand Hotel downtown. They've offered to let us stay there while we figure things out. Amber is not handling things well. I wouldn't expect her to, I acknowledged. Her carefully constructed world is collapsing. She keeps saying you'll change your mind, that once you've made your point, you'll cancel the house sale and help us reschedule the wedding. He studied my face carefully. But you won't, will you? No, I confirmed. The house sale is proceeding. The wedding vendors have been paid their cancellation fees. And tomorrow, I'm leaving for the Carolina coast. Blake absorbed this with a thoughtful nod. I thought as much. For what it's worth, Mrs. Carter, I'm sorry. Not just for how today has unfolded, but for my role in allowing Amber's misrepresentations to continue. I should have questioned things more thoroughly. The apology surprised me with its maturity and self-awareness. Perhaps there was more substance to Blake than I'd given him credit for beneath the Prescott polish. We all have our blind spots, Blake. Especially when it comes to those we love. My mother appeared with a tea tray, setting it on the small table between us. Evening, Blake, she greeted him with minimal warmth. Interesting day you've had. Mrs. Carter, the elder, he acknowledged with a slight smile. That's certainly one way to describe it. Helen poured tea with practiced efficiency. And what are your plans now, young man? Besides imposing on my daughter's final evening before her departure? Mother, I chided gently, though I appreciated her protective instinct. Blake accepted the tea with a respectful nod. Honestly, I'm not sure. Everything I thought I knew about my relationship, my future, it's all in question now. Good, Helen pronounced firmly. Questions lead to better answers than assumptions. Blake smiled faintly at this blunt wisdom. My father said something similar earlier today. We sipped our tea in surprisingly comfortable silence as darkness fully enveloped the yard. Finally, Blake set his cup down with a decisive clink. I should go. Amber is at the hotel and there's a lot to discuss. He stood, extending his hand first to Helen, then to me. Thank you for talking with me, and for the clarity you've provided, however painfully it came about. After he left, Helen and I remained on the porch, the night sounds creating a peaceful backdrop to our thoughts. He seems less shallow than I expected, my mother observed. Yes, I agreed, though whether that's enough to weather this crisis with Amber remains to be seen. That's their journey now, Helen said firmly. Yours lies elsewhere. She patted my hand again. South, specifically. Toward sunshine and salt air and a life where you're not constantly bankrolling other people's dreams. I smiled at her characteristic directness. Will you be all right without me nearby? Fishing about for an invitation to join you? She teased. Don't worry about me. Alice Thompson and I have a standing canasta game on Thursdays, and the senior center keeps me busy enough. Besides, they invented telephones for a reason. As we sat together in companionable silence, I felt the first genuine stirrings of excitement about tomorrow's journey. For decades, my identity had been defined primarily through motherhood, through Amber's needs, achievements, and demands. Now, at 58, I was finally free to discover who Sophia Carter might be when not viewed through the lens of maternal obligation. It was terrifying. It was liberating. It was, perhaps, long overdue. Sunday morning arrived with the soft clarity that follows a storm, both the literal thundershower that had passed through overnight and the emotional tempest of the previous day. I awoke early, my bedroom already half dismantled, essential items packed in the car I'd rented for the one-way drive to North Carolina. My mother had insisted on staying the night, claiming concern about the weather, but transparently wanting to extend our time together before my departure. Now she sat at my kitchen table, hands curled around a mug of coffee, watching as I made final preparations. You'll call when you reach each stop? She asked, not for the first time. I mapped it out. You should reach Richmond by nightfall if you leave within the hour. Yes, Mom, I replied, the familiar rhythm of parent-child concern, now curiously reversed. I've got hotel reservations in Richmond tonight and Wilmington tomorrow. I'll check in with regular updates. Good. She nodded firmly. And you have the realtor's number? The one I recommended in Carolina Beach? Listed in my contacts and we've already exchanged emails, I assured her. She's lined up 3 properties to show me on Tuesday. Helen seemed satisfied, though I could see the emotion she was working to contain. My mother had never been demonstrative, having been raised in an era when stoicism was considered a virtue, but her feelings ran deep beneath the practical exterior. "I'm proud of you, Sophia," she said suddenly, catching me off guard. "Not many people have the courage to start over at 58. "I'm not sure it's courage so much as necessity," I admitted, pausing in my preparations. I couldn't stay here, continuing as if nothing had changed. Not after what Amber said, not after realizing how she truly sees me. "Sometimes the most courageous acts are those we undertake because we have no other choice," Helen observed. "Your father used to say that true character is revealed not when everything is going well, but when the foundations shake beneath your feet." The mention of my father, gone 15 years now, brought a bittersweet smile. "He'd be appalled by the way Amber has acted." "Completely," Helen agreed without hesitation. "But he'd be tremendously proud of you, as am I." This simple affirmation, mother to daughter, across the generational divide, provided unexpected balm to the still raw wound of Amber's rejection. At least one maternal relationship in our family remained intact, grounded in mutual respect rather than exploitation. By 9 o'clock, my car was loaded with essentials: clothes, important documents, cherished books, and the few family heirlooms I couldn't bear to leave behind. Everything else would either be donated or stored until I established my new home. "It's time," I told my mother, checking my watch. "I need to stop by Maple Avenue before heading to the highway." Helen's eyebrows rose. "You're going to the house? Is that wise?" "Necessary, not wise," I clarified. "I need to check that Amber and Blake have removed their belongings as instructed. The new owners want vacant possession, and the closing is tomorrow morning. Jonathan will handle the paperwork in my absence." "And if they haven't cleared out?" Helen asked practically. "Then what remains becomes part of the donation I've arranged," I replied, my voice firmer than I felt. The deadline was clear. Helen nodded, respecting my decision despite her evident concern. "I'll follow in my car so I can drive myself home afterward." The morning was bright and clear as we made the 15-minute drive across town to the stately colonial on Maple Avenue that had been my father's pride and joy. Pulling into the driveway, I noted immediately that Blake's car was absent, though remnants of hasty packing were evident. Discarded packing materials on the front lawn. The garage door ajar, revealing half-empty storage shelves. "Looks like they've been busy," Helen observed as we approached the front door. Using my key, a proprietary action that still felt natural despite the property's imminent transfer, I entered the house that had been in our family for 2 generations. The immediate impression was one of abandoned chaos: empty picture hooks on walls, rectangular dust outlines where furniture had stood, discarded packaging materials scattered across floors. "They've cleared out the major items," I noted, moving through the foyer into the living room. Though their housekeeping leaves something to be desired. "Amber was never one for cleaning up her own messes," Helen remarked dryly. "Literally or figuratively." Room by room, we surveyed the hastily vacated house. The kitchen, recently renovated at my expense, stood eerily empty, expensive appliances gleaming in contrast to the detritus of rapid departure. Upstairs, closets hung open with scattered hangers, bathroom cabinets displayed abandoned toiletries deemed not worth packing, and wastebaskets overflowed with discarded possessions. In what had been Amber and Blake's bedroom, a peculiar sight awaited. A neat stack of photo albums placed deliberately in the center of the floor where their bed had stood. I recognized them immediately. The carefully curated collection of Amber's childhood photographs I'd assembled over years, documenting everything from first steps to law school graduation. "She left your photo albums," Helen observed, her tone unreadable. "So she did." I knelt beside the stack, opening the top album to a page showcasing 7-year-old Amber proudly displaying her first lost tooth. The gap-toothed smile, so innocent and genuine, bore little resemblance to the poised, calculating woman who had told me to disappear from her life. "Are you taking them with you?" Helen asked. I considered the question seriously, weighing the emotional significance against the practical limitations of my already packed car. More importantly, I examined my own feelings about carrying these physical reminders of a relationship now fundamentally altered. "No," I decided finally. "I'll keep a few special photographs, but these albums belong to the past, to a relationship that no longer exists in the form these pictures celebrate." Helen nodded, understanding in her eyes. "The cleaning crew comes tomorrow?" "Yes, before the new owners walk through," I confirmed, rising to my feet. They'll remove anything left behind and prepare the house for its new family. We continued our inspection, reaching the small home office that had been my father's domain and, more recently, Blake's work-from-home space. The desk was gone, but a single envelope remained propped against the windowsill, my name written across it in Blake's precise handwriting. With a sense of curiosity rather than trepidation, I opened it. Sophia, by the time you read this, we will have vacated the house as instructed. I want to thank you for the generosity you've shown over the years. Generosity I didn't fully comprehend until yesterday. Amber and I have had difficult conversations since leaving your home. She is struggling to reconcile her actions with her self-image, which I believe will be a lengthy process. For my part, I am reevaluating many aspects of our relationship and the foundations upon which we've built our life together. I don't know what the future holds for Amber and me, but I wanted you to know that your actions, while painful, have created an opportunity for necessary truth. Whatever happens next, that truth is valuable. I've ensured we've removed all personal belongings. The photo albums in the master bedroom are intentionally left for your decision. Amber was uncertain whether you would want them. I wish you peace in your new beginning. Respectfully, Blake. I handed the letter to my mother, who read it with raised eyebrows. She said when she finished. More depth to that young man than I gave him credit for. Yes, I agreed, though his future with Amber remains questionable based on his wording. As it should, Helen pronounced firmly. A relationship built on lies and manipulation offers a poor foundation for marriage. We completed our inspection, confirming that all personal items had indeed been removed, if somewhat haphazardly. As we prepared to leave, I paused in the center of the living room, taking a final look at the house that had featured so prominently in our family history. Here, my father had hosted Sunday dinners for decades. Here, Amber had taken her first steps across the hardwood floors. Here, family holidays and milestones had been celebrated through years of changing circumstances. Saying goodbye? Helen asked gently, noting my contemplative stance. In a way, I acknowledged, not just to the house, but to what it represents. The past, the version of motherhood I've been clinging to. The idea that sacrifice equals love. And what will you say hello to? My mother asked, her practical nature always seeking the balance. I smiled, feeling the weight of decades of maternal obligation beginning to lift. Possibility. Self-determination. A life defined by my own choices rather than someone else's needs or expectations. Good, Helen said firmly. It's about time. As we locked the house for the final time, I felt none of the melancholy I'd anticipated. Only a growing certainty that the path ahead, while unfamiliar, offered liberation I'd long denied myself. In the driveway, my mother embraced me with surprising strength for her 83 years. Drive safely, call often, and don't look back too much. I won't, I promised, returning her embrace. Take care of yourself until I get settled enough for you to visit. Oh, I will, she assured me with the resilience that had carried her through decades of life's challenges. Alice Thompson and I are thinking of taking a pottery class at the senior center. Never too late to play with mud, she says. This glimpse of my mother's continuing engagement with life, her refusal to stagnate even in her 80s, bolstered my own determination. If Helen Carter could embrace new experiences at 83, surely her daughter could reimagine her life at 58. With a final wave, I began the journey south, the house on Maple Avenue receding in my rearview mirror. A structure that had sheltered 3 generations of our family, now passing to new owners who would create their own history within its walls. Ahead lay Richmond, Wilmington, Carolina Beach, and beyond those geographical markers, a future unencumbered by expectation or obligation. A future entirely my own. For the first time in decades, the road ahead felt not like an extension of established patterns, but the beginning of something entirely new. Monday morning found me in Wilmington, North Carolina, awakening to the distant sound of seagulls and the gentle murmur of waves. My hotel, situated along the Cape Fear River with views of the Atlantic beyond, offered a tranquil introduction to coastal living, a stark contrast to the emotional turbulence I'd left behind. I'd driven nearly 10 hours the previous day, stopping in Richmond only long enough to sleep before continuing south. The steady rhythm of highway travel had provided unexpected therapy, each mile increasing the distance not just geographically, but emotionally from the life I was leaving behind. Over breakfast on the hotel's riverside terrace, I checked my phone for the first time since yesterday afternoon. 23 missed calls, 12 from Amber, 5 from unknown numbers, likely wedding guests still seeking explanations, 3 from my sister in Phoenix, 2 from Jonathan Mills confirming the house closing, and 1 from my mother. I listened to Helen's voicemail first. Sophia, it's Mom. Just checking that you made it to Richmond safely. Alice Thompson says her niece's wedding was completely ruined by your dramatic stunt. Her words, not mine. I told her some things matter more than finger sandwiches and champagne toasts. Anyway, drive carefully today. Call when you reach Wilmington. I smiled at my mother's blunt defense of my actions, then dialed her number. Our conversation was brief and practical. Yes, I'd arrived safely. Yes, I'd slept adequately. Yes, the weather was favorable for house hunting. The steadiness of her voice, so matter-of-fact and unwavering, provided ballast as I prepared to navigate my first full day of this new chapter. Jonathan's voicemails confirmed that the house closing was proceeding as scheduled. The buyers completed their final walkthrough this morning. No issues reported. We'll sign the paperwork at 2 p.m. my time, and the funds should be in your account by end of business day. I've drafted a power of attorney as discussed, so you needn't return for the signing. I texted him a brief acknowledgement, then turned my attention to the 3 messages from my sister, Claire. Unlike our mother's practical inquiries, Claire's voicemails escalated from confusion to indignation to reluctant understanding. Sophia, what's happening? I just got a bizarre call from Cousin Edward saying Amber's wedding was cancelled and you've disappeared. Call me back, then. Seriously, Sophia? I've now heard from 4 different relatives with 4 different versions of what happened. One claims you had a mental breakdown, another says Amber disowned you, and Aunt Patricia insists you've joined a cult. Whatever's going on, I deserve to hear it directly from you. And finally, sent late last night. Mom filled me in. I get it now. For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. Call when you're ready to talk. Love you. I made a mental note to call Claire later, once I'd completed my appointments with the realtor. My sister and I had never been particularly close. The 8-year age gap and her early marriage to a military officer who'd stationed them far from our hometown had created more distance than just geography, but her eventual support was nonetheless comforting. I deliberately left Amber's voicemails unheard. Whatever pleas or accusations she'd left could wait until I felt sufficiently grounded in my new reality to receive them without being pulled back into old patterns. At 10 o'clock precisely, Sandra Whitaker of Coastal Carolina Properties arrived at my hotel. A brisk woman in her 60s with salt and pepper hair and the weathered complexion of someone who spent considerable time outdoors, she greeted me with a firm handshake and no-nonsense demeanor. Helen's daughter, she said, more statement than question. I see the resemblance. Your mother and I served on the hospital auxiliary board together before I moved south 30 years ago. Formidable woman. That she is, I agreed, immediately appreciating Sandra's direct approach. She mentioned you're looking for something on the water. Permanent residence, not a vacation rental or investment property. That's right. Something modest but sturdy. I'd like to walk on the beach every morning. Sandra nodded approvingly. Smart thinking. I'm showing you 3 properties today. One in Carolina Beach, one in Cure Beach, and one a bit farther north in Wrightsville. Each has distinct advantages. We'll start with the smallest and work our way up if that suits you. As we drove in Sandra's SUV, she provided a running commentary on the coastal communities, their demographics, amenities, hurricane preparedness measures, and social opportunities. The landscape passing outside my window offered a soothing palette of blue skies, sandy shores, and maritime forests that felt worlds away from the manicured suburbs I'd left behind. The first property, a compact 2-bedroom cottage in Carolina Beach, just 2 blocks from the ocean, charmed me with its wide front porch and bright, airy interior. Recently renovated with practical vinyl plank flooring and quartz countertops, it offered turnkey simplicity with minimal maintenance. Hurricane shutters installed last year, Sandra noted as we toured the small but efficient space. Impact-resistant windows, new roof rated for 130 manicure winds. Previous owner was an engineer, didn't cut corners on the important stuff. I could picture myself here. Morning coffee on the porch, afternoon walks on the nearby beach, evenings spent reading in the cozy living room. The simplicity appealed after decades in a larger home filled with the accumulated possessions of family life. The second property, a more spacious townhouse in Cure Beach with direct ocean views from a second-floor balcony, offered luxury I hadn't anticipated being able to afford. When Sandra mentioned the price, nearly $100,000 more than the cottage, I began to shake my head. "Before you decide, you should know this is a motivated seller," she informed me. "Divorce situation needs to close quickly. They've already reduced the price twice." Despite the attractive terms, I couldn't quite connect with the property's contemporary styling and community association restrictions. "It's beautiful," I acknowledged, "but doesn't feel like me." Sandra nodded, unsurprised. "I thought you might say that. The third property is quite different. Older, more character, directly on the water, but not on the main beach. It's on the sound side in Wrightsville, with a private dock. Needs some updating, but has good bones." As we drove north toward Wrightsville Beach, I found myself growing increasingly comfortable with Sandra's company. Unlike the overly solicitous realtors I'd encountered in the past, she presented properties factually, pointing out both advantages and potential concerns, without emotional manipulation. "Your mother mentioned you're making a fresh start," she commented as we crossed the bridge to Wrightsville. "Left some difficult family situation behind." "That's one way to put it," I acknowledged, surprised by Helen's disclosure, but not offended. Sandra nodded thoughtfully. "I did something similar at 52. Left a 30-year marriage in Ohio, moved here knowing no one. Best decision I ever made." She glanced at me briefly. "It's scary at first, starting over when everyone else seems settled. But there's something powerful about choosing your own path, especially when you've spent decades accommodating others." This simple understanding, from someone who'd walked a similar road, eased something tight within my chest. "Did you ever regret it?" I asked. "The break? The move?" "Not once," she replied without hesitation. "Missed certain people, certainly. Had difficult days, absolutely. But regret the decision? Never." We turned onto a narrow road bordered by live oaks draped with Spanish moss, their ancient branches creating a natural canopy. At the end of the lane stood a weathered blue cottage, its wide wraparound porch facing a tranquil expanse of water where the intracoastal waterway widened into a small sound. "It's not oceanfront," Sandra cautioned as we parked. "The Atlantic is about a half-mile that way, easy walking distance. But this," she gestured toward the glistening water view, "this offers a different kind of peace. Less dramatic than ocean waves, but perhaps more constant." The moment I stepped onto the porch, something shifted inside me. A recognition, a sense of possibility I hadn't anticipated. The cottage itself was modest, 2 bedrooms, an open living dining area, a kitchen that had last been updated in the early 2000s, but its placement on the waterfront lot and the quality of light filtering through mature trees created an atmosphere of tranquil sanctuary. "The dock needs some repair," Sandra pointed out as we walked the property. "And the kitchen could use updating if you're so inclined. But the roof is sound, the foundation is excellent, and the flood elevation meets current codes." At the end of the dock, I stood watching a great blue heron stalking its lunch in the shallows, its patient focus emblematic of the unhurried rhythm of coastal life. In that moment, I could envision mornings spent on this dock with coffee and a book, evenings watching spectacular sunsets across the water, nights listening to gentle lapping waves rather than suburban traffic. "The owner is an elderly woman moving to assisted living," Sandra explained as we returned to the cottage. "Her children live out of state and want a quick, uncomplicated sale. She's owned it for 40 years, raised her family here during summers, then lived year-round after her husband passed." Inside, the cottage showed signs of its age and long occupancy. Faded curtains, well-worn hardwood floors, kitchen cabinets in a style popular decades ago. Yet unlike the sterile perfection of the townhouse or the impersonal renovation of the first cottage, this home carried a sense of history, of lives well lived within its walls. In the primary bedroom, a large picture window overlooked the water, positioned perfectly to watch the sunrise. I stood before it, imagining awakening to this view each morning, a daily reminder of beauty and possibility rather than obligation and constraint. "What are you thinking?" Sandra asked, observing my contemplative stance. "I'm thinking," I replied slowly, "that this place feels like it could become home. Not just a house, but a home." Sandra smiled, the expression softening her practical demeanor. "That's not something you can manufacture with granite countertops or stainless appliances. That feeling of rightness, of belonging, that's worth listening to." As we completed our tour, I found myself mentally placing my few cherished possessions within these rooms, imagining new furniture arrangements, considering paint colors that would complement the water views. For the first time since leaving my old life behind, I was looking forward rather than back, planning for what could be rather than mourning what had been. "I'd like to make an offer," I told Sandra as we prepared to leave. "On this one, the blue cottage." She nodded, unsurprised. "I thought you might. Let's head back to my office and draft the paperwork. With the proceeds from your home sale, we could potentially close very quickly, within weeks rather than months." As we drove away, I turned for a final glimpse of the weathered blue cottage, my potential future home. Unlike the house on Maple Avenue with its burden of family history and painful memories, this modest structure offered something infinitely more valuable: the promise of self-determined days and peaceful nights, free from the weight of unreasonable expectations and unappreciated sacrifice. It wasn't the future I'd planned. It was, perhaps, something better. 3 weeks passed in a whirlwind of paperwork, planning, and practical adjustments to coastal living. The offer on the blue cottage, officially named Heron's Rest, according to the weathered sign hanging beside the front door, had been accepted without counter-offers or complications. The elderly owner, upon learning of my own fresh start, had even left several pieces of furniture that suited the cottage's character better than any new purchases could have. The closing had been straightforward, and with surprising efficiency, I found myself in possession of both a new home and a new beginning. Sandra Whitaker had proven invaluable beyond her role as realtor, introducing me to reliable local contractors, recommending everything from the best seafood market to the most trustworthy insurance agent, and generally facilitating my integration into the coastal community. Today marked the completion of the essential renovations I'd commissioned, minor but meaningful changes to make Heron's Rest truly mine. The kitchen now featured updated appliances while preserving the charming original cabinets, merely refreshed with new hardware and paint. The bathrooms had been modernized with efficient fixtures that maintained the cottage's vintage appeal. Most significantly, the dock had been professionally repaired and reinforced, ensuring safe access to the water that had so captivated me during my first visit. Standing at the end of that dock in the golden afternoon light, I felt the salt-tinged breeze against my face and marveled at how different my life had become in just 1 month. The constant tension I'd carried in my shoulders for years had eased. The reflexive checking of my phone for messages from Amber had diminished. The habit of considering others' needs before my own had begun to loosen its grip. My phone chimed with a text, not from Amber, whose messages I still couldn't bring myself to read, but from my mother. "Contractor finished with the dock? Still planning to pick me up from the airport tomorrow?" I smiled, typing back, "Dock is perfect. Flight still on time? We'll be there at 2:15. Helen had insisted on visiting once I was properly settled, her practical nature preventing her from making the trip until the renovations were complete and the cottage fully functional. Tomorrow would mark her first visit to my new home, a milestone I anticipated with both pleasure and a touch of anxiety. My mother had always been supportive, but she was also unapologetically honest in her assessments. As I returned to the cottage to prepare dinner, I noted the blinking light on my landline answering machine, a deliberate anachronism I'd installed after discovering my cell phone reception could be spotty near the water. Pressing the button, I heard Jonathan Mills's measured tones. "Sophia, just checking in on the follow-up paperwork for the Maple Avenue sale. Everything's finalized on our end, but there's one matter I wanted to discuss with you. Could you give me a call when convenient? No urgency, just a loose end that needs addressing." Curious, I dialed his number, grateful when he answered, despite the approaching end of the business day. "Jonathan, it's Sophia. You called about the house sale?" "Ah, Sophia. Yes, thank you for returning my call promptly. How's coastal living treating you?" "Wonderfully," I replied honestly. "I feel like I can breathe again." "Excellent. Well-deserved, I'd say." He cleared his throat with the slight awkwardness that often characterized his transitions to difficult topics. "The reason for my call: there's been a development regarding the house on Maple Avenue. Nothing concerning about the sale itself," he hastened to add, "but rather about something discovered after you left." My curiosity deepened. "What sort of development?" The new owners were completing some pre-move-in deep cleaning and discovered a hidden compartment in the master bedroom closet, apparently behind a false panel your father had installed years ago. Inside was a safety deposit box key and documentation indicating a box at First National that hasn't been accessed in over 15 years. My father's bank, I murmured, memories surfacing of accompanying him on Saturday morning errands, waiting patiently in the lobby while he disappeared into the vault area. I had no idea he maintained a safety deposit box. Nor did I, despite handling his estate, Jonathan acknowledged. It wasn't mentioned in any of his papers. The new owners very honorably turned the key and documentation over to me as the attorney of record for the property sale. That was decent of them, I noted, impressed by this unexpected integrity. Indeed, I took the liberty of accessing the box yesterday as your legal representative. Jonathan's voice took on a more formal tone. Sophia, I believe you should be aware of its contents before deciding how to proceed. Something in his careful phrasing alerted me. What did you find, Jonathan? He hesitated briefly. Several items of significant interest. First, a letter from your father addressed to you, dated shortly before his passing. Second, documentation regarding certain financial arrangements he made concerning Amber. And third, what appears to be substantial evidence of impropriety on the part of Amber's father when he left your family. I sat down abruptly, the implications of Jonathan's measured words washing over me. What kind of impropriety? The kind that typically involves law enforcement, Jonathan replied delicately. Your father appears to have compiled evidence that David Monroe embezzled significant funds from his employer before disappearing from your lives. From the documentation, it seems your father chose not to pursue the matter for your and Amber's sake. Despite having sufficient evidence to prompt criminal charges, the revelation struck like a physical blow. David Monroe, the charming, unreliable man who'd swept me off my feet in my 20s, married me impulsively, fathered Amber, then vanished when she was 5, claiming commitment wasn't his style. A criminal fugitive? It seemed simultaneously shocking, and yet in retrospect, perfectly aligned with his character. Why would my father keep this secret? I wondered aloud. Why not tell me at least? His letter addresses that question, Jonathan said gently. I didn't read it fully. It was clearly personal. But the opening paragraph mentions protecting both you and Amber from painful truths until certain appropriate circumstances arose. My mind raced, connecting disparate pieces across decades. My father's inexplicable generosity after David left, the practical support that had kept Amber and me afloat during those difficult early years. His occasional cryptic comments about David getting what he deserved eventually. His insistence on establishing educational trusts for Amber that I couldn't access for other purposes. What does this mean for Amber? I asked, parental concern automatically surfacing despite recent events. Legally? Nothing directly. The statute of limitations on the financial crimes has expired, based on my preliminary review. But the documentation includes something else that might be relevant to her personally. Evidence suggesting David established a new identity in Arizona and may have started another family there. My free hand gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, steadying myself against this cascade of revelation. Amber might have half-siblings she knows nothing about. It appears possible, Jonathan confirmed. The information is somewhat dated, of course, but substantive enough that it could provide a starting point if she wished to investigate further. I closed my eyes, processing the implications. After Amber's cruel rejection and my consequent departure, would she even want this information? Would it help her understand certain patterns in her own behavior, or merely provide another source of pain? What would you advise, Jonathan? He considered this thoughtfully. Professionally, I'd suggest retrieving the contents of the safety deposit box and reviewing them privately before making any decisions. Personally, he paused, the boundary between lawyer and family friend momentarily blurred. Personally, I believe your father preserved this information for a reason, waiting for the right moment. Perhaps that moment has arrived. After ending the call, I stood at my kitchen window, watching herons wade in the shallows as evening approached. The peaceful scene contrasted sharply with the turbulence of my thoughts. Just when I'd begun establishing a new life, independent of old family dynamics, this discovery threatened to pull me back into Amber's orbit, not as the rejected mother, but as the bearer of potentially life-altering information. What responsibility did I have to share my father's discoveries with a daughter who had told me to disappear from her life? What right did I have to withhold information that might help her understand her own history and tendencies? As darkness settled over the water, I reached a decision. Tomorrow, after collecting my mother from the airport, we would drive directly to Jonathan's office to retrieve the safety deposit box contents. Together, Helen and I would review my father's letter and the evidence he'd compiled. Only then, with full understanding of what my father had preserved and why, would I decide what constituted my final maternal obligation to the daughter who had rejected me, what, a little gift, I would leave in the empty space between us before fully embracing my new beginning. Whatever that decision might be, it would be made from a position of strength and clarity rather than reaction and hurt. That alone represented progress in my journey towards self-reclamation. The airport reunion with my mother proceeded with her characteristic efficiency. No dramatic embraces or excessive emotion, just a firm hug, practical questions about the drive, and immediate inquiries about my new home. At 83, Helen Carter remained remarkably self-sufficient, managing her rolling carry-on with determined independence despite my offers of assistance. "You look better," she pronounced as we walked to the parking area. "Less burdened. The sea air agrees with you." "It does," I agreed, realizing the truth in her assessment. The coastal environment had brought physical changes. My complexion had developed a healthy glow from morning beach walks. My posture had improved without the weight of constant tension, and I'd even begun letting my hair grow out from its practical bob into softer, more natural waves. "Jonathan Mills called me," Helen mentioned as we loaded her modest luggage into my car. "Mentioned something about your father's safety deposit box. Said we'd be stopping by his office?" "Yes," I confirmed, unsurprised that Jonathan had contacted her directly. My mother and father had been close friends with the attorney for decades before my father's death. It made sense that Jonathan would view her as a stakeholder in this discovery. "Apparently Dad left some sensitive information regarding Amber's father." Helen's expression sharpened with interest. "David Monroe. Never trusted that man. Your father had concerns about him that went beyond his abandonment of you and Amber." This caught my attention. "You knew about this?" "Not specifics," she clarified, as we began the drive toward downtown Wilmington, where Jonathan's office was located. "But I knew Robert was investigating something. He was protective of you, didn't want to add to your burdens while you were already dealing with single motherhood and a devastated 5-year-old. The revelation that my mother had known at least peripherally about my father's concerns added another layer to this unfolding family mystery. "Why didn't you ever mention this?" Helen shrugged slightly. "Robert asked me not to. Said some truths serve no purpose unless circumstances make them necessary. I trusted his judgment." As we navigated through Wilmington's historic downtown toward the converted Victorian that housed Jonathan's law practice, I wondered what circumstances my father might have deemed necessary to warrant revealing his discoveries. Perhaps a moment exactly like this, when Amber's character and choices had forced a fundamental reconsideration of our relationship. Jonathan welcomed us into his office with the formal courtesy that characterized his professional demeanor, though his genuine affection for my mother was evident in the way he solicitously ensured she had the most comfortable chair. "I've brought the contents of the safety deposit box," he explained, indicating a weathered leather portfolio on his desk. "As I mentioned to Sophia, there are several components: a personal letter, financial documentation, and evidence regarding David Monroe's departure. Thank you for handling this so discreetly," I said, eyeing the portfolio with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Of course," Jonathan hesitated, then added, "I believe I've fulfilled my professional obligation by retrieving these materials and transferring them to you. What happens next is entirely your decision, Sophia. Would you prefer privacy to review the contents?" I glanced at my mother, who sat alert and composed, her practical nature grounding what might otherwise feel like a melodramatic scene from a mystery novel. "No need. Mom is family. Whatever Dad preserved concerns her granddaughter after all." Jonathan nodded, sliding the portfolio toward me before excusing himself with a murmured comment about giving us time to process the materials. The portfolio's leather was soft with age, the brass closure tarnished from years of disuse. Opening it revealed 3 distinct sections, each carefully labeled in my father's precise handwriting. For Sophia, David Monroe, evidence, and Amber's trust. I began with the personal letter, removing several pages of heavy stationery covered in my father's distinctive script. The date at the top, March 17, 2007, placed it just 2 weeks before his unexpected death from a heart attack. "Go ahead," Helen encouraged softly. "Read it aloud if you'd like." Taking a deep breath, I began. "My dearest Sophia, if you're reading this letter, circumstances have arisen that prompted Jonathan to share the contents of this safety deposit box with you. I've instructed him to keep these materials secure until either I retrieve them myself, in which case you'll never see this letter, or until a situation develops where this information becomes necessary for your well-being or Amber's. The timing of your discovery is therefore significant, representing either my failure to resolve these matters during my lifetime or the emergence of circumstances I've long feared might eventually materialize. What I've documented here concerns David Monroe, the man who abandoned you and Amber 15 years ago. His departure, which caused such pain and disruption in your lives, was not the impulsive act of an immature man unable to handle responsibility, as you've believed. It was a calculated disappearance driven by criminal necessity. Shortly before David left, I began noticing discrepancies in his behavior. Expensive purchases inconsistent with his stated income, late-night phone calls, increasing secrecy about his whereabouts. My concerns prompted me to make inquiries through business connections, leading to a disturbing discovery. David had been systematically embezzling funds from Meridian Financial, where he worked in the accounting department. When confronted privately with my suspicions, he neither confirmed nor denied them, but within 48 hours, he had disappeared from your lives. 3 days later, Meridian Financial discovered the embezzlement, nearly $425,000 missing, through a sophisticated scheme of falsified records and diverted transactions. I faced a terrible choice: share this information with you and the authorities, potentially subjecting you and 5-year-old Amber to a public scandal and criminal investigation, or remain silent, protecting you both from additional trauma while allowing a criminal to escape justice. I chose protection over justice, a decision I've questioned many times over the years. To compensate for my silence, I privately replaced the stolen funds through an anonymous donation to Meridian's parent company, preventing the financial damage David had inflicted without exposing his crimes publicly. My investigations didn't end there. Through private channels, I tracked David to Arizona, where he established a new identity as Daniel Matthews. The documentation in this portfolio provides evidence of this transformation, including his marriage to Catherine Brennan in 2000 and the birth of 2 children, Emma, 2001, and Joshua, 2003. I've maintained this surveillance not out of vindictiveness, but from concern that David Daniel might someday attempt to re-enter your lives, potentially causing further harm. My contacts report that he has apparently stabilized, maintaining legitimate employment and family commitments in Phoenix for several years now. Whether this represents genuine reform or merely deeper deception, I cannot say. The question that has haunted me is whether Amber should know these truths about her father. Would understanding the reality of his departure provide healing context or simply inflict new wounds? Is a child better served by protective illusions or difficult truths? I've ultimately concluded that this decision belongs to you, Sophia. You know your daughter's heart and resilience better than anyone. The third section of this portfolio contains documentation of the trust I've established for Amber, funds equivalent to what David stole, set aside for her education and future security. Whether you choose to explain the origin of these funds is, again, your decision. If circumstances have prompted Jonathan to share these materials now, I trust that the timing is appropriate and necessary. Whatever situation has developed, remember that your judgment has always been sound, your heart unfailingly generous, and your resilience remarkable. With enduring love and confidence in your wisdom, Dad, I lowered the letter, my vision blurred with tears. My father's voice, practical, thoughtful, deeply caring, seemed to fill the room, bridging the 15-year absence with immediate presence. He knew, I said finally, looking up at my mother. Somehow, he anticipated that someday I would need this information, that something might happen with Amber. Helen nodded, her own eyes suspiciously bright. Your father was exceptionally perceptive about people and patterns. He probably recognized certain traits in Amber even when she was young, tendencies inherited from David that might eventually create significant challenges. I considered this, remembering moments from Amber's childhood and adolescence that had troubled me, despite my maternal inclination to see the best in her. The casual lies told for convenience, the manipulation of others' perceptions, the selective presentation of facts to create desired impressions. Traits that had culminated in her elaborate deceptions about our family finances and her cruel rejection when those deceptions were threatened. Nature and nurture, I murmured. All these years, I've blamed myself for Amber's behavior, wondered what I did wrong in raising her, how I failed to instill better values. But perhaps some of these tendencies were inherited, encoded in her DNA from a father who could systematically steal from his employer and abandon his family without apparent remorse. That doesn't absolve her of responsibility for her choices, Helen pointed out pragmatically. Understanding origins isn't the same as excusing actions. No, I agreed, but it provides context and possibly direction for what happens next. I turned my attention to the other sections of the portfolio, examining the meticulously organized evidence my father had compiled about David Monroe's crimes and subsequent reinvention as Daniel Matthews. Driver's license photocopies, address records, employment verifications, even school registration forms for the half-siblings Amber had never known existed, all presented with my father's characteristic thoroughness. The final section, labeled Amber's Trust, contained financial documents establishing an educational fund in Amber's name, the same fund I had eventually used to finance her undergraduate and law school education, believing it to be simply my father's generous gift rather than a form of restitution for her father's crimes. The question now, I said, closing the portfolio after we had examined everything, is what to do with this information. Dad left the decision to me, but I'm not sure what serves Amber best at this point, or what I'm obligated to share given our current estrangement. Helen considered this thoughtfully. What would you want if you were in her position? The question cut through my confusion with clarifying simplicity. If I were Amber, struggling to understand my own tendencies, potentially repeating destructive patterns without recognizing their origins, wouldn't I want the opportunity to see myself more clearly through this knowledge? Not as an excuse, but as an explanation that might enable better choices moving forward. I'd want to know, I said finally. Even if the truth was painful, I'd want the chance to understand myself better through understanding where I came from. Helen nodded, satisfied with my conclusion. Then I believe you have your answer. As we prepared to leave Jonathan's office, the shape of my final maternal gesture toward Amber began to crystallize. Not vengeful, not punitive, but clarifying. A gift of truth that might illuminate the shadows of her own behavior, offering one last opportunity for growth even as I continued my separate journey forward. A little gift I would leave in the empty space between us was taking form, not a farewell so much as a final offering. Whether Amber would recognize it as such remained to be seen. The week following my mother's arrival unfolded in a pleasant rhythm of showing her my new life, morning walks along the shoreline, introducing her to neighbors who had already welcomed me warmly, evenings on the dock watching spectacular sunsets paint the sky in impossible colors. Helen approached coastal living with her characteristic practical assessment, noting the humidity's effects on different materials, evaluating local services with discerning consideration, and ultimately pronouncing the blue cottage sensibly charming, in what constituted high praise from her pragmatic perspective. "You've done well here," she remarked on our fifth evening as we sat on the porch with glasses of iced tea. "Not just with the property, but with yourself. You're different." "Different how?" I asked, curious about her perception. "More present," she replied, after careful consideration. "For decades, you've been partially absent from your own life, always anticipating someone else's needs, always adjusting your responses to manage others' emotions. Now you're fully here, inhabiting your moments rather than merely servicing them." The insight struck me with its accuracy. Throughout my marriage, single motherhood, and subsequent years, I had indeed lived in a state of divided attention, physically present, but mentally occupied with calculations of others' requirements and expectations. That constant internal monitoring had become so habitual, I'd stopped noticing its drain on my energy and authenticity. "I think you're right," I acknowledged. "There's a freedom in not constantly adjusting myself to accommodate someone else's narrative." Helen nodded, satisfied with my recognition. "Now, about the David Monroe situation. Have you decided how to proceed?" I had, in fact, spent considerable time contemplating this question while showing Helen around my new community. The portfolio from my father's safety deposit box remained on my desk, its contents reviewed multiple times as I considered various approaches. "I'm going to send Amber the information," I confirmed. "Not everything. Not Dad's personal letter to me or the financial documentation about the trust, but the evidence about David's crimes and his new identity in Arizona, including the existence of her half-siblings. She deserves to know that part of her history." "And how will you deliver this information?" Helen asked, "given that you've had no contact since the wedding day?" This question had occupied much of my consideration. A direct meeting seemed inadvisable, too charged with emotional potential, too likely to devolve into recriminations or manipulative pleas. Electronic transmission felt impersonal for something so significant. Traditional mail seemed too easily ignored or discarded. "I've decided on a specific approach," I explained. "Jonathan is helping me arrange it." The following morning, after Helen and I enjoyed breakfast on the dock, I drove to a local print shop where I had arranged to create a carefully curated presentation of the essential documents from my father's collection. The result was a bound portfolio, professional, objective, neither accusatory nor apologetic in its organization. I included a brief introductory letter explaining the recent discovery of my father's safety deposit box and his long-ago investigation into David Monroe's disappearance. The tone remained neutral, focused on providing information rather than commentary. I carefully avoided any mention of Amber's behavior toward me or the parallel patterns between her father's deceptions and her own. The final page contained the current address and contact information for Daniel Matthews, formerly David Monroe, and his family in Phoenix, verified as accurate through Jonathan's discreet inquiries. Whether Amber chose to initiate contact with her father and half-siblings would be entirely her decision. I was simply providing the possibility. With the portfolio complete, I returned to Heron's Rest, where Helen waited with packed bags, her week-long visit concluding that afternoon. As I drove her to the airport, she asked the question I'd been anticipating. "When will you deliver the portfolio to Amber?" "Tomorrow," I replied. "Jonathan has arranged everything. A courier will deliver it to the address where she and Blake are currently staying, his parents' guest house, apparently." Helen nodded, absorbing this information. "And if she reaches out afterward? If she calls or tries to visit?" This possibility had featured prominently in my considerations. If Amber responded with genuine introspection and authentic remorse, how would I navigate potential reconciliation while maintaining the healthy boundaries I'd established? Conversely, if she reacted with denial or anger, dismissing the information as irrelevant or attacking me for sharing it, how would I protect my newfound peace? "I don't know," I admitted honestly. "I suppose I'll evaluate that situation if it arises. But the portfolio includes no invitation for contact, no suggestion of reconciliation, no requests for apology. It's simply information she has the right to know, presented without agenda." "Very diplomatic," Helen observed. "And the empty house? You mentioned something about leaving a special present there before the new owners took possession." I smiled, recalling the final detail Jonathan had arranged at my request. "Yes, that's being handled this afternoon." After seeing my mother off at the airport with promises of another visit during the holidays, I returned to my cottage feeling strangely light. Tomorrow, the portfolio would be delivered to Amber, my final maternal act, neither vindictive nor self-sacrificing. Today, another gesture was being completed at the empty house on Maple Avenue. Jonathan had confirmed that the new owners had agreed to a final walk-through delay of 24 hours to accommodate a special delivery to the vacant property. The cleaning crew had completed their work days earlier, leaving the house pristine and empty, ready for its new occupants. Except for one carefully arranged item in the center of the living room floor. I'd selected a simple wooden box, handcrafted by a local Wilmington artisan, its surface smooth and warm to the touch. Inside, I'd placed a single photograph, Amber at 5 years old, sitting on my father's lap as he read her a story. The image captured the moment before darkness entered her life through her father's abandonment, before patterns of deception and entitlement had calcified into her adult personality. Beneath the photograph lay a small, sealed envelope containing a handwritten note with just 3 lines. "Every story has origins beyond our control. Every life offers chances to transcend them. Choose wisely. No signature, no accusation, no plea for reconciliation or expression of continuing hurt. Simply an invitation to awareness, the most precious gift I could offer after years of enabling through silence and sacrifice. According to Jonathan's arrangements, Blake would be notified about a final item requiring attention at the empty house. Given Amber's recent avoidance of practical responsibilities, it would likely be Blake who arrived to discover the box positioned precisely where Amber had stood when she'd told me to disappear from her life. What happened after that discovery was beyond my control or responsibility. Whether Amber recognized the opportunity for growth contained in both the portfolio and the simple wooden box, whether she chose to examine her own patterns in light of her father's history, whether she eventually sought contact or maintained our separation, all these outcomes belong to her journey now, not mine. At sunset, I received a text from Jonathan. Delivery completed at Maple Avenue. Courier scheduled for portfolio tomorrow at 10 a.m. I sent a brief acknowledgement, then set my phone aside and walked down to the dock where the evening light gilded the water's surface. A pair of herons waded in the shallows, their patient focus a lesson in presence and acceptance. For 28 years, my identity had been inextricably bound to motherhood, to Amber's needs, achievements, and eventually her rejection. That chapter had now conclusively closed with my final maternal offerings. Truth about her father, and an invitation to self-awareness, delivered without expectation or demand. What opened before me now was a chapter entirely my own, a life defined by my choices rather than others' requirements. The blue cottage with its weathered charm and peaceful waterfront. The new community beginning to embrace me as a neighbor and potential friend. The creative pursuits I'd long deferred, but recently begun exploring again. As darkness settled over the water and stars emerged in the clearing sky, I felt no regret for the family bonds that had fractured, only appreciation for the self I was reclaiming in their absence. Whatever Amber chose to do with the knowledge I'd provided, whether it prompted growth or denial, contact or continued silence, her journey belonged to her now. Mine stretched before me like the star-flecked waters of the Intracoastal Waterway, reflecting both past and possibility, but flowing inevitably forward toward horizons I was finally free to explore on my own terms. The worst mother anyone could have? Perhaps in Amber's distorted perception. But for myself, I had become something far more important. A woman who had finally learned that self-respect is not selfishness, that boundaries are not betrayal, and that the most authentic form of love sometimes requires walking away rather than accepting ongoing harm. That knowledge, hard won through pain but ultimately liberating, was perhaps the most valuable gift of all.